Good afternoon, everyone. Everyone ready to go? My name is Danny Smyth, SMYTH. I'm the chief here in Winnipeg. My purpose today is to report on an incident that occurred yesterday at a family services office on Provencher Blvd. Just after 11 a.m., police were summoned by employees working at this facility. They were reporting an agitated male trying to physically drag a woman believed to be his partner out of the building. Officers were informed by the caller that the male had a mental health history, and general patrol and tactical support officers were dispatched to the facility. Now, upon arrival, tactical officers encountered the male in the lobby of the building. When he saw them, he disengaged with the woman and focused his attention on the officers. He grabbed an object from a nearby desk. It was later recognized to be a pencil, and held it up to his own throat and threatened to harm himself. Now, the officers there attempted to de-escalate the situation using verbal commands, but it had no effect. They resorted to using an intermediate weapon that included a 40 millimeter impact weapon and a taser. And these two had limited success in incapacitating him, but he did fall to the ground, where officers were able to grapple with him and restrain him using handcuffs. Now, the male was still acting fairly erratically. Paramedics were called in, and they assisted by sedating the male and transporting him to hospital, where he was examined for his injuries and admitted for an assessment. Now, the female partner and the staff working at the facility were unharmed. There are no criminal charges being brought against this male. I think it's important to clarify a couple of things, and just so you know, IAU is putting out a release probably simultaneously right now. The 40 millimeter impact weapon is considered a firearm, and the rounds, they're like foam rounds that are rubber tipped. When they were discharged, they caused a bruise to the male's leg. But by definition, this is a firearms discharge that caused an injury and is a mandatory notification to the Independent Investigations Unit. So they will take jurisdiction of this investigation. And just as far as the taser goes, it was ineffective because the probes didn't connect when it was discharged. So these types of calls are often considered well-being checks. In this case, the call was dispatched as a domestic, and the occurrence was classified as a mental health act occurrence. This call had a positive outcome. No one was seriously injured. But I can say that these types of calls are trending up in Winnipeg. Well-being checks, domestics, suicide threats, they're all trending up. The circumstances of each of these incidents must be considered at the time when we get the call to determine the appropriate response. So I'll give you another example. On January 1st, we were dispatched to a retail store on Portage Avenue where a male armed with an axe was threatening suicide. So again, General Patrol and tactical support units were dispatched. And our strategic priority is kind of like this. First and foremost, the safety of the general public. Secondly, the safety of our officers. And then finally, the safety of the suspect or the affected person. And it's usually in that order. So in this case, an intermediate weapon was again deployed to prevent that situation from escalating. So again, it was a 40 millimeter impact weapon that was deployed. However, in this case, there were no injuries on that suspect. So there was no mandatory requirement to notify IAU. They didn't need to take the investigation. In that case, the male was safely taken into care and conveyed to the hospital for an assessment. So one of the other things I want to make clear, because I heard some talk about this throughout the week, is neither of these calls would have been suitable for ARC, that alternative response to crisis unit. These were both volatile situations with armed people or with people threatening harm. An ARC is utilized for non-emergency calls that do not involve violence or the risk of violence. As police were called upon to respond to these occurrences, which involved anything from people in mental health crisis, to a person with a drug-induced psychosis, to a person acting hysterical for unknown reasons. When we go, only when we are satisfied that the situation is stabilized and safe, then and only then will we consider introducing a clinician to that kind of a scenario. Our members are well trained by our officer safety unit. It includes an awful lot of scenario-based training on everything from high-stress decision-making. It involves de-escalation and the appropriate levels of force. It also includes scenario training associated to mental health, including agitated, chaotic event communication and de-escalation, as well as applied suicide intervention. The vast majority of the occurrences that we are involved in do not result in injury and do not require any kind of use of force, but sometimes it is unavoidable. We do our best to equip and train our officers so they can perform their duties safely. That's all I have prepared, because the IIU is going to put out I thought it was appropriate to address that because it's kind of an unusual situation with the intermediate weapon.
Chief, can you just clarify a little bit? Was the male already inside with the female? Were they there together?
Yeah,
Had he come inside?
I don't know if he showed up after, but they were definitely within the family services facility.
And you said your officers were able to identify that it was mental health history. Were they given that information?
So they were informed of that through the caller. Again, they take that at face value, so it's planted in the back of their mind. Certainly, he was acting agitated and erratically when they arrived.
And you used the foam rounds. How often is that the first time that that's used?
No, we've had that. We've had that for a long time. I think one of the distinctions here is that that particular weapon was reclassified during a recent change in legislation. So now it's considered a firearm. So that changes the way that we would notify IIU. So any firearm that involves an injury, no matter how minor the injury might be, still fits the criteria for a notification. So that's why you see a more public notification in this case. We've had that tool as part of our tactical support team for many years.
Sorry, I meant how often is that the first time that you would use that as opposed to going to the next step for force?
They have that weapon as part of their arsenal or part of their intermediate tools. So use of force will go from verbal commands right up to lethal force. There's a whole series of things in between that we call intermediate weapons. That can be a baton, that can be pepper spray, that can be this impact weapon that I'm referencing today, and it can also be a taser.
You mentioned that well-being or mental health related calls are trending up. Is there any explanation as to why you're seeing more of these calls?
I don't know for certain. I think people will have to study that more closely. I certainly see an impact that the isolation that the pandemic has had. This trend started around the start of the pandemic. We're attending calls like this almost 21,000 times a year now. It's surpassed domestics, and that domestics used to always be the highest call for service that we would take. It's still high at around 17,000 a year, but these sort of wellness checks and these mental health crisis type things, they're certainly surpassed even domestics in the last couple of years.
In your view, is there anything that can be done in a more broader sense, I guess, to help people in these mental health issues?
I certainly hear the government trying to focus attention on expanding mental health services in the community, hiring more clinicians. I think that will be helpful. If you've ever tried to get those kinds of services, you'll find that there's not enough out there, and I can speak to that from my own family experience. But, it's one of those things where I think that will help. Of course, I think the way we are deploying the ARC, that's a good way of diverting people so that they get into the type of care that they need. The distinction here is that it's just not appropriate to send a clinician into a violent situation. So, um, you know, it's trying to triage and find the right level of support for people.
Chief Smyth, just on relation to the escalation and these types of calls, are we also seeing an escalation in violent results? We have 3 deaths, and this is the second injury being investigated by the IIU in the last month. While we see an increase in these types of calls, will we also see an increase in violent results?
So we're not. And, I can put that into context with you. When it comes to just use of force in general, about 0.33% of the calls that we attend, so less than 0.5% of the calls we attend, even require any type of use of force. And I'm not even talking about lethal force. So that's been consistent for many, many years. I think to put it into perspective, people just need to realize that these kinds of events are not distributed equally. So they can come in clusters. We can go like we did in 2022 or 2022. We went a full year without having any kind of lethal force at all. So they can come in clusters, and they're not evenly distributed throughout the city. So I think it's necessary to put that in perspective.
So a bit of an anomaly or spike right now?
I hate to use the term anomaly, but clearly we've seen in the past month we've had four incidents that sort of hit this criteria.
Just another question.
Yeah.
Kind of looking back into last year, just in terms of violent incidents with youth offenders, I think there was about 40 last year. Some of them very serious crimes involving death and the like. Is that normal, or are we seeing an increase in youth-related offenses?
So in the last year, we've definitely seen a spike in youth-related crime. But again, in perspective, it's still lower than the five-year trend, the 5-year average. But it is alarming that we're seeing youth involved in what's become some pretty serious and some pretty newsworthy events.
Chief, some of those police-related incidents that, with the use of force that resulted in fatalities, specifically at the end of last year,
Yeah.
have really renewed a call for body-worn cameras. I know it's something we've talked a lot to you about. Is it something that you would support now? What would you like to see for the
So I've always been open to that. You'll recall that in 2021, through the police board, we introduced a proposal that just didn't get any traction through city council at that time. You're seeing different agencies across North America and frankly across Canada that are starting to move in that direction. Toronto, Calgary, Vancouver is just introducing it now. The RCMP are preparing to start distributing body worn. So I do think eventually most agencies will have it. It's a costly thing, no question about it. It's not a panacea to stop any of this necessarily, but it is a way for us to be more transparent and accountable for interaction that occurs daily.
Do you think it would help with the public and their trust towards police? Because I know that we've seen some of those cases. We see the cell phone footage and people that question use of force when those videos come out. Do you think that would help?
So it will help with some, for sure. There will always be a contingent of people that don't trust the police. But I should remind you that even the latest Leger polls in the fall, the institution of policing has a pretty high public trust, over 70%. There's no other institution that's got a level of trust like that. So while we will always strive to do more, the level of trust of policing across the country is pretty high.
When you look at the cost-benefit analysis, and I know you're not the one putting the money out there, do you think it is worth it?
I think for some they'll think it's worth it, and I think for others they'll say no. So ultimately it's a council decision. As I said, I was very open to doing that. We put a proposal together and forwarded that through the police board in 2021. There was no interest at that time. I don't know if political will has changed since then.
Back to this situation, do you know how common it is for a suspect or someone who's in crisis to get sedated after being in police custody?
It depends sometimes why they're, and we don't know at the time. We rely heavily on the medical professionals, in this case, the paramedics. Sometimes it can be drug induced. Sometimes it can be just, a pure mental health crisis. So, we trust the paramedics when they determine to do something like that. There has been a number of occasions when they have sedated people so that they can safely transport them to hospital.
You mentioned the other recent incidents involving lethal force. And maybe it's inevitable that maybe, there may be some comparisons between them and this incident.
Sure.
In those previous two, so the Furby Street
Furby,
incident
yeah.
and then the University Crescent incident, were tasers used or less lethal methods used in those incidents, or?
So two very different scenarios, two very different circumstances. So as you know, on Furby, that was an incident command structure where we had various levels of support there, including hostage negotiators, the TAC unit, all kind of orchestrated by an incident commander. So there was an awful lot of surveillance and monitoring going on in that situation. In University Crescent, I'm kind of not in a position to know what happened because it resulted in a death. I'm not privy to it now. The investigators from IIU are the ones doing that. So to answer your question, because I don't know what led up to it other than the call that took us there, I don't know if there would have been an opportunity to introduce an intermediate level.
ARC, you mentioned ARC. I know just in speaking to some people in the last week, there's been some advocates who would like to see more of a civilian-led response to non-violent, non-emergent situations, similar to what Toronto has introduced.
So I think if you're going to use Toronto as your comparator, I would invite you to actually research what they do there, because they don't go to violent, volatile situations. Again, they go to non-urgent, non-violent situations. So very similar to what we would use ARC for. So, there are some cities that do variations of things. Most have those sort of packed units where it's police and crisis workers or clinicians. But some also have just clinicians that go on their own. But very specifically are they triaged to go to non-violent, non-emergent calls. And Toronto's no different than that. So that narrative that we would be sending clinicians to these volatile type of calls, that's a little ill-advised, I would think. And I tried to make that clear as to why we wouldn't do that in the briefing today.
So in a situation where it would meet the criteria for a civilian-led response, is that the type of program or team or unit, whatever you want to call it, that you would be open to having in Winnipeg, or that you would?
So again, I would be open to seeing the expansion of ARC, what might include teams like that. But I remind all of you, there are not enough clinicians in this city or in this country to meet the needs right now. So, that's what's preventing us from getting to 7-day coverage now. It's just we don't have enough clinicians to embed.
Chief, I just have a question on training. We're talking about use of force, and there was the one year, a recent year, that there was no fatalities. We had 3 in a very short time, about 5 weeks at the end of this year. Is there any sort of training when that happens in such a short period for so many, that then does it spark an immediate need for retraining of anything, or how often are officers?
So
retrained?
our officers recertify every year with their levels of force, and that includes everything from verbal command right through the intermediate weapons right up to lethal weapons, which would include their firearms. So they certify on that every year. A lot of de-escalation training is layered into not only our officer safety training, but our mental health training and other training that we provide, so that de-escalation is one of the common themes throughout that.
But there's
So
also,
it's a combination of both online and scenario-based training.
but officers that might be involved in an incident that results in a fatality don't necessarily automatically then get recertified right away. They still would wait.
Not necessarily, but what does happen when something happens is there's a review of a situation, particularly if we're involved and it doesn't involve an outside agency to be investigating it. We certainly review our own, and if we see a training need or a training gap, we try to address it. Not just in use of force, but even driver training, pursuit training, that kind of thing. So always alive to additional training.
Chief Smyth, just back to this one, this incident, I should say. Did you clarify whether there was any drug use involved? You said the taser didn't work because of a malfunction, not because he wasn't.
Yeah, so the way
feeling
the taser works, it sends out a probe, right? Two probes actually, but if both probes don't connect, it doesn't create a circuit. So the energy doesn't.
So it had nothing to do with
No.
any sort of substances he might have been on?
No, and to be clear, I don't know if he was on any substance because, that would be kind of medical information. He isn't charged criminally with anything. So for us, we steered him to the hospital. He was assessed for the bruise, and he's being assessed for his health there.
Why
old
no
is he?
criminal charges in this case? I understand there was a mental health component here and it does go into that. Is that the reasoning why, or he was holding somebody and dragging them, potentially assault?
So potentially an assault, but the complainant and the victim has some control over what they want done. And in this instance, there was not wanting to go through the criminal process.
How old is the man?
Oh, good question. I should have written that down. I don't have it handy, but we can get that for you at the end.
And were they there for child custody matter?
So I don't know specifically. What I do know is they're relatively new to Manitoba. They came from Ontario. Because they're in a family services, I assume it was for some kind of family service, but I wouldn't really be privy to that.
You mentioned after the officer-involved incident at Broadway in Sherbrooke
Yeah.
a few months ago.
Yeah.
In your Substack post, sort of suggested, it talked about the narrative and sort of suggested that in the future that the police service may be more willing to provide more context or more information. So the last 2 or 3 officer-involved incidents you've been up here speaking to the media. Is this the new norm now?
I think so. I think it's important at times to provide context on some of these things. It's a balancing act because I have to be respectful to the integrity of the IIU investigation. And I've been around long enough to know how much can be said. But I think leading up to an event, especially one that involves a death, I think it's important to put it into context.
Any officers from the 3 latest incidents, so Burby, University Crescent, and yesterday on Provencher.
Yeah.
Any officers placed on leave at all after being involved?
So the event yesterday did not necessitate any kind of sort of pause for the officers involved as far as I know. Typically when there's a death or a serious injury, we do have a protocol where our members will have a check-in with the behavioral health unit, which includes a psychologist, just to make sure they're in a good place so that they can return to work and also participate in the investigation. So that's pretty normal for anyone involved in a real traumatic situation, whether it's a death or any other kind of trauma. There's a whole host of scenarios that could put somebody in front of the behavioral health unit for a check-in. So we're pretty alive to the wellness of our own officers and making sure that they're well supported.
Can you tell how long did the intervention last?
Pardon me?
How long did it last, the intervention yesterday?
It wasn't very long. It would have all occurred probably within 5 or 10 minutes. The units were nearby. So as it happened, the tactile unit was the first to arrive. So that's why they ended up engaging when they arrived. But from start to finish, it was pretty quick. There would have been a pause for the paramedics to come in and transport him. And of course, as I said, they sedated him.
Any more questions on yesterday's or recent incidents? The male was 30.
And do you know how old the female is?
Your 30s.
We can get you the, did you get it?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Just in terms of the Kirby incident.
Yeah.
The 52-year-old man was shot by police. His status in the homicide investigation, is it still a person of interest, or would you classify him as a suspect?
I think, I haven't had a briefing from homicide since then. They would have been interested in speaking to him. They'll probably try to piece it together by speaking to other witnesses now. I haven't had an update on that, but I can certainly look into that.
I was going to ask as well, do you anticipate after that incident, the officer involved incident?
Yeah.
Do you anticipate that there will be any arrests in connection with the homicide?
I don't know. I generally wait for homicide to bring forward things when they advance. They've had a number of other matters that they've attended to. As you know, we had our first homicide of the year today, so they've been pretty busy over the holidays. All right.
All right,
Thank you, everyone.